And prior to the unions, there were folks that were called the Luddites, and they were or machine breakers, and they were, you know, they thought the answer was to go back to feudalism, so they went and they burned the mills, and then you could get the death penalty for burning a loom, and they were serious.
Well, we got sidetracked before when you were talking of Proudhon. This was his energy too, was he wanted to return to an earlier.
Property is theft.
Well, Proudhon, he was a thinker, and he was kind of a utopian socialistic thinker. In his thesis that he put out in his book, The Philosophy of Poverty, and he argued property is theft because it comes from exploiting workers. So therefore, what we have to do is all the workers have to get together, and we have to pool our money, and we'll set up these cooperatives. He'd drawn them all up about how these cooperatives would be set up, and we'll pool our money and we'll set up these ideal cooperatives, and there'll be no factories. The production will just be, you know, this feudal thing, and we'll build this kind of utopia that he had envisioned. And then you got another figure come along, LaSalle, who had the same idea, except it wasn't we're going to pool our money, it's we're going to get our guns together and, you know, take over. And then, one of the best things Marx did, one of his greatest contributions, was organizing the textile workers to strike in solidarity against the Civil War, against slavery in the U.S. Because during the Civil War, the northern U.S. blockaded the South so that cotton couldn't be shipped out of the South to England to the textile mills, and so that hurt the Southern economy. And the British wanted to break the blockade to save the textile industry and go and support slavery in the South. And Karl Marx organized, you know, these mass meetings and strikes to prevent Britain, and ultimately succeeded, prevented Britain from breaking the blockade and saving the South, and possibly even coming into the war on the side of the South. And that was one of Marx's greatest contributions, was his involvement in that struggle.
Well, we never hear about that in our history of the United States.
The fact that Karl Marx wrote letters to Lincoln. And he was a journalist during the American Civil War for the New York Tribune, which was kind of...
supported himself as a journalist for the Tribune.
And barely supported himself. I mean, the man lived in absolute poverty his entire life. I mean, you know, something like, he had 6 children, and all but 2 of them died, I believe, you know. I mean, he was not doing well, ever.
He had some support from Engels as well, but during this period, his primary support was the income from the writing.
Yeah, the New York Tribune, and he was analyzing with his theory, his theories about the American Civil War, and commenting on it, and writing letters, and he wrote an open. I mean, the International Working Men's Association, they wrote letters to Lincoln, praising him, you know, supporting him in his re-election. There was actually a general in the Union Army who was a member of the International Working Men's Association.
Really?
He was a general in the Union Army who fought and was openly about it. And another thing, it's kind of interesting that there were draft riots in New York City, and one of the calls in New York City, the role that it was then called the U.S. branch of the International Working Men's Association was called the National Labor Union, NLU, and their call was for people to enlist and fight slavery, you know, and fight against it. And they had the slogan that labor cannot be free when half of it is in chains, you know, and it was a great call. But ultimately, the greatest contribution that came out of the First International has to be the Paris Commune and the formation of the Paris Commune in 1871. And that was when France and Prussia, which was the German, were at war. The French were losing, and cut a deal. The French bourgeoisie cut a deal with the Germans and said, you know, we'll let you take over, just let us, you know, stay in. But the workers in Paris overwhelmingly did not want to be colonized by Germany. And so they overthrew the government of the rich, and they took over in order to not be occupied by Germany. And they set up the first socialist state, the first dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx had called it. Dictatorship not being that there's, you know, one man who stands there and hits the podium, but dictatorship as in, you know, that the dictates come not from the bankers and the rich, but from the people.
As in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which we're living on.
One of their first reforms is they abolished night work for bakers. So there were no one had to work at night. They made it so government officials didn't get any more than the highest paid workers. So there was no corruption. They replaced the police with a popular militia. So instead of having a bunch of guys with guns who keep everyone in line, everyone themselves has a firearm, and we police themselves through democratic assemblies. They abolished the church and replaced it again with the temples of reason that had been you know, during the French Revolution. They abolished unemployment. They gave full employment. They socialized the hotels and put all the homeless people into the hotels so there was no homelessness. And they set the city up, and they lasted for 8 months, despite even the French government that had surrendered took up arms to put down the workers who refused to surrender to the Germans. The leader of the French people who were putting down the commune was a guy named Thiers. And he was a brutal person. And it's really interesting because I had a professor from France when I was in college, and we saw a famous painting about the Paris Commune, because one of the big things they did during the Paris Commune is they tore down, there was a monument that had been built to Napoleon. It was like the imperial block, and they famously tore it down, and they pulled it down symbolically and smashed it. And there's a famous painting of that. And my professor from France, who grew up in Paris, the way they even sum up the Paris Commune now is really interesting, because it shows how revolutions are remembered, that the Paris Commune, it had all these big ideals, but so many people died as a result of it being created. You know, it was just, you know, they just, you know, tried to, you know, but they shouldn't have tried to have the revolution because so many people died. Well, here's the thing.
They should have just died like poor people always die.
Right, right.
Malnutrition and overwork.
But the thing is, the people died not because of the commune. They died after the commune when the former French government aligned with the Germans went into Paris. They lined up every person who had any title or any activism in the. They lined them up against the wall and shot them. I mean, they killed thousands and thousands of people. I mean, because they didn't want. They called it the cancer. They didn't want to spread throughout Europe. The Paris Commune. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of different ideological groups within the commune. The bulk of the commune was followers of this Blanc, this Louis-Auguste Blanc, who had the theory, he agreed with Marx about a dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat needs to come to power, but he didn't believe in building a working class movement. The followers of Blanc, they just believed, you know, there were a lot of former French revolutionaries, and they had the idea that they could just get together and have a coup d'etat, and then they would institute socialism. They didn't understand that you had to have a broad working class movement. There are some elements who were just kind of reminiscent. They called themselves neo-Jacobins, and they didn't believe in class at all. They just believed in kind of a more utopian society. And then on the other end of it, you had, you know, trade unionists and Marxists and overwhelmingly. But that was the first time. And Karl Marx wrote a very lengthy book called The Civil War in France, where he laid out, you know, what was achieved in the Paris Commune. And one